and 8. And 8 is their number of the new day. It's the number of Horus, or the rising sun, having to do with the pagan festival of Ishtar, Easter. To them, 2020 is just beginning year 8, the new day. And they wanted to get it off to a good start. I would contend that this CO Video 19 crisis we've been subjected to here in the spring of 2020 was a sort of blood sacrifice to their gods that they intended for the beginning of their new millennium, having it begin bathed in blood. Now, when we look back in history at events that have occurred during this time of year, there is another that stands out. It was kind of the 9/11 of its era. People in the know, behind the scenes, understood exactly what the significance truly was, but they weren't heard. That monumental event was the sinking of the Titanic on April 14th, 1912. In the calm waters of an ice-cold North Atlantic, 100 years before the end of another Babylonian millennium, the Titanic sailed at a maximum speed across that ocean on a pitch-black, star-filled and moonless night into a known field of icebergs. There had been numerous radio reports concerning the location of those many drifting masses of glacial ice. At the time, radio communications were done ship to ship and port to port by telegraph. Unreleased and unknown to the public in those days was the capability to triangulate a ship's relative position using radio signal strength. From their positions nearby, other ships, which were stopped for the night, including, by some reports, a rudimentary early submarine, had been tracking the location of icebergs in the area. Some contend that the iceberg field's location information was being conveyed to the captain of the Titanic. He was responsible for precisely aiming Titanic at the center of the field of icebergs during those very dark midnight hours. Did he maybe have a deal lined up somehow get off the boat after? Was that promise not honored? We don't know. What was going on with this whole setup? Why were all these pieces put in motion? It was because the Titanic was never intended to make the crossing intact. It had to go down. For their Babylonian ritual, it was to be a death ship from the day it was put on the drawing boards, actually designing it that way for a purpose. But who would plan such a dastardly event? How could anything so monstrous and monumental actually be prepared and accomplished? And what would be the point? At that time in 1911, America had just experienced a huge financial crisis that even involved government offices having to close because they could not pay their bills. The US was stretched thin from war in the Philippines and other things, so they weren't getting the job done. And 2 years earlier, in April 1910, 7 of the richest men in the world, cumulatively the single wealthiest group of people in the world at that time, had gotten together to map out a plot at a place called Jekyll Island, one of the Golden Isles barrier islands off the coast of Georgia. In order to reach their goal of creating a new private central bank that would again siphon money from American labor, they analyzed who and what was in opposition and how they had to go about eliminating those challenges that were standing in the way of these 7 wealthy men controlling our money creation. They would do whatever was needed to get into a position to earn future interest from us, just as rich men had tried to set up for our country in the past. Before those other central banks were kicked out for being on unneeded, for being, before those other central banks were kicked out for being an unneeded service. The end result of that Jekyll Island meeting was this planned event on the North Atlantic Ocean. Their time on that island was just an interim planning session to make sure they had all the jots and tittles in the right place. Leading up to their planned vote in the 1913 US Congress, where they took control of our money when few were paying attention on Christmas Eve of that year. Of course, the number of yes votes needed for the majority at a special holiday session like that, with the right payoffs, guaranteed their desired result. The winter solstice, which we now celebrate as the Christmas season, in Roman times was celebrated with an event called the Saturnalia Festival. I wrote extensively about that in a previous article. This detail is relevant here because Saturn's temple in Rome was the place where Roman coinage was minted. For these wizards, there is a symbology in capturing the authority to manufacture and control the minting of money in America at the precise time of the Roman Saturnalia festival. See, the king of misrule and his princes. What a Christmas present we received when they created the Federal Reserve Board, a private entity that is no more federal than the Federal Express. And this mostly foreign and English banking cartel, run primarily by Jesuits, not Jews, would therefore print and manage America's money supply while charging us interest for handling our money, which is just colored paper without any gold backing or even real money management assistance. It's their vig, their take by this bunch of bloodline family mobsters who are European thugs, mostly out of the city of London. The Titanic was a part of the White Star Line, which, by the way, is code for Sirius, the dog star, which is the brightest star in the night sky. That shipping line was owned by Morgan, and the Titanic was set up as the most magnificent and unsinkable ship ever to float the oceans. Morgan was scheduled to get on the ship, making the crossing from England to the US, with the other elites who would be on his boat, the richest American businessmen of that time. The plan was that they could talk during this voyage and try to come up with a solution that would eliminate these engineered banking crises that mysteriously keep happening to us at the time during our country's most pervious financial crises. And while JP Morgan was head of the Morgan banking interests, which was the largest bank in America, he had personally guaranteed money to keep our government going while we worked out a solution. Even up to today, America just keeps getting buried in debt to these foreign bankers. John Jacob Astor was on board and arguably the richest single man on the planet at the time. Astor was an American who opposed the type of national bank that eventually became the Federal Reserve. Other wealthy American businessmen on the ship were Isidor Straus and Benjamin Guggenheim. Cumulatively, those three represented the largest single block of wealth in our country. And each man was solidly opposed to this European orchestrated central bank. They were all going to be on board the Titanic with J.P. Morgan to talk these things over and try leaving the ship with an acceptable solution that could be pushed politically and brought to pass, eliminating our monetary and government payment, servicing the debt crises. Government employees having to stay home with no paycheck was not acceptable. So, as these wealthy Americans and all the other passengers got onto that enormous ship in London, J.P. Morgan's bags, his servants, and everything he would need for the trip had been brought to the boat, and much of it was visibly loaded. Inexplicably, his most valuable possessions, including rare paintings, were held back at the last moment. Reportedly, Morgan was ready to board and everyone was anxiously awaiting his arrival. Being a bit of a diva, Morgan was expected to arrive at the last minute because he was such an important person. Suddenly, with very short notice and few on the boat even realizing what had happened, J.P. Morgan apparently had other things come up and could not depart with the other prominent men for these crucial meetings. Morgan stayed behind. After the boat had left the dock, those in the first class section were shocked to find out he wasn't even on the boat. But still, the huge vessel continued on its voyage. Anyway, they had no clue about their situation being on a death ship. And the cruise steamed ahead with the reality that these famous and celebrated men had been baited onto that boat. That ship was always intended to attract them into this gilded cage that would be taken to the North Atlantic and sunk in a ritual that was designed to secure these foreign bankers' position of control over America. The Titanic was sailing at full speed when it crashed into the iceberg. One interesting feature of that ship was a very small rudder, making it impossible to turn as quickly as would have been intended. All it needed was heading information that steered the boat right to that iceberg. And according to many, if the ice hadn't taken it out, the submarine was available in the area to give Titanic the coup de grace, which turned out to be unnecessary. Here's an unknown aspect of that ship sitting on the bottom of the ocean right now. It's not the Titanic. That is not even the ship you think. Instead, it is the Titanic's sister ship, her twin, the Olympic. Fantastic research has been done by multiple people who have meticulously documented this, including photos showing the Titanic was swapped with the Olympic while they were parked beside each other in dry dock. Why would they do that? Well, the Olympic was the first of the two ships to be built, making it more advanced in its construction timetable. And during the testing phase, the Olympic hit a British military ship coming out through a clearing as it left the harbor. That collision put a gash the length of a football field on the starboard side of Olympic's forward bow. This Titanic sister was taken to a shipyard and repaired, but the work done wasn't using the highest quality steel. In fact, they used cheap pig iron that is much more fragile and, of course, buckles easily. Relative to the steel that would have been used. So that pig iron on this huge gash right at the waterline made it a fragile ship. There are photographs of the ship swapping as it occurred, not only as the Olympics substituted for the real Titanic, but of course their badging had to be exchanged as well. From that point, you have a much more fragile Titanic, already crippled before he even left the dock. The ship was sent out across the ocean with all of those business people and other blood sacrifices to move into the takedown position at the altar, at that altar. Again, this was a plot and plan by those wizards to gain control over America, though it was a huge tragedy of lives lost. The incident looked relatively inconsequential to the financial affairs of the world on that day. Because few understood the leverage those deaths had on the fate of America, even up to right now, over 100 years later. When we as Americans consider the Federal Reserve our monetary system that we don't own, which was created on December 24th of 1913 and came into power the next year, what was it that happened to America? We were warned about foreign central banks like what we have now running the Federal Reserve System, a private banking organization that took over the creation, manufacture, and pricing of our money. Repeatedly, we were warned that these bankers would do what they've always done: print money like madmen, lower interest rates, get a whole bunch of loans out there, and then suddenly reverse course to spring their trap, stopping the flow of money, raising the interest rates to the moon, and in that way, grabbing their ill-gotten gains from the boom and bust cycles that snatch away people's life savings. After creation of their predatory bank, the foreign bankers employed those cycles almost immediately. What happened with the crash of 1929? It started in Europe when the bankers withdrew credit, setting off a daisy chain of financial busts that reached America in the fall of 1929, with our stock market crash and the collapse of business. What gain did these bankers collect? What action did those bloodline families take? They bought the dazed people's farms and businesses for pennies, even fractions of a penny on the dollar. It's hard to imagine. In the course of all this, we've had to go through boom, bust, depression, and war cycles. Every time they get us into a useful enough depression where all the young guys aren't able to find work and there is nothing for them to do, up pops a war so our children can join the army to pay the bills, send money home to mom, and be able to marry their girl. But many won't do those things despite joining. That's because they don't come home in one piece or even alive, thus thinning our population to deprive us our best, brightest, and strongest, which allows the globalist to control us a bit more by fear. John Kennedy understood all this as the bankers tried to start another war with him sitting as president. He presided over the Bay of Pigs incident in Cuba. They were stirring up trouble every time he turned around. JFK knew these sorts of global threats were being dealt out by the secret societies infiltrating America, as opposed to any potential doomed overt invasion against the strongest military on earth. Most everyone around him was compromised, leaving Kennedy not knowing which of his aides, officials, and even cabinet holders were good or bad. There were also issues with the Dulles brothers, CIA, State Department, and most everywhere else in the government. He couldn't win for losing. And when Kennedy was killed, what happened to the real money? Not phony Federal Reserve banknote currency he had created with Executive Order 11110. The day after he was assassinated in Dallas, the no-interest U.S. currency that Kennedy had created was all revoked and bought back up. As payback to those behind the assassination, one of the very first acts of Lyndon Johnson was to revoke that non-central bank money. When we look at the Q project, in light of what's happening in our country right now, we have to remember that the central focal point of the whole operation is to reverse the effects of a coup that occurred at the killing of President Kennedy. And in order to do so, it's not just a political issue or military fight, and not only a way to wake up the American people to what's really happening. It's also about removing the sharp teeth of those money monsters, getting their fangs out of us as a country that is being bled dry by vampires as they take the wealth out of America to make themselves stronger in order to do their globalist mischief around the planet. What is the deception and problem the bankers have created for us today? Because President T, with loyal factions of the military backing him, are fighting and methodically dismantling the systems that the globalists have had in place for over 100 years to control, manipulate, and make us do their will through our sweat labor. How have these bloodline wizards from the City of London responded? Through lies, impeachment, the media, riots, taking down the economy, and every other way they know how, they have tried to neutralize what our president and the patriots around him are doing. Instead of just one or two bad people, we've seen many infiltrators who have been embedded in the administration around this president. In some cases, these conspirators were planted there decades ago with a plan to be available at any critical moment needed. They are there to say just the right thing in the administration's ear, to make the timely wrong recommendation, steering us right back into slavery. They are saboteurs standing by to take any position where they might be needed to short-stop whatever the president and his patriot allies might do to regain control of our country, in order for them to retake the ship of state's helm. The patriots' battle happening right this second in our country and the world is the result of long planning. It's exactly like their efforts with the Titanic, which took many years of strategizing, all the way from boat design to the accident that by design didn't have enough lifeboats or the ability to launch them readily. When tragedy struck as intended, the doomed were given no way to efficiently disembark all the passengers. It appeared to be mere insanity to design a ship with an inadequate number of lifeboats, but it was part of their plan that has much in common with today's plandemic. At the time of Titanic's or Olympics sinking, headlines worldwide had everyone wanting to know who was dead or living, who made it and who hadn't. To be continued. Find out. This has been a reading of Kid by the Side of the Road by JUAN SAVIN Digital. All holds and owns no copyrights to this material for educational purposes only.